In this movie I want to talk about hardscapes. Hardscapes are part of Vectorworks Landmark and Vectorworks Designer, and the hardscape tool exists in the site planning toolset, which has this icon here, and the tool itself looks like this one here. Now, a hardscape can represent an area of paving or hardscape, but because of the variety of fills you can give it, it can also represent something like a pool or a water feature, or really anything that you want, you can think of to use it. Let's switch to a layer that has some hardscapes on it and just generally talk about the two different kinds. This here is known as a boundary hardscape, and this has been defined by drawing a boundary representing its perimeter, and I can see the boundary by double clicking, and you'll see that these blue reshape handles define the outer perimeter of the hardscape, of the boundary hardscape. And if I pick one of these up and move it, then however I've defined the boundary or the internal parts of the hardscape, they're just going to follow along and change shape, and of course the main area and border area are going to follow as well. Now, as you can see here, it's possible to add a tag to a hardscape, and the tag can have a floating leader to it. It can have an arrow on the end that you can customize. It can have just the name of the hardscape. It can have the name and the areas. There's a variety of things that can be displayed here, and the tag can be hidden, of course, if you don't want to have the tag. The second kind of hardscape you can have is known as a pathway hardscape, and this kind of hardscape is defined by drawing a line that you want the hardscape to follow. And in this case, if I double click it again to edit it, you'll see that the line that defines this hardscape actually runs down the center of it. And if I move the control points, then however I have the hardscape set up, with the edging and whatever's in the middle are going to follow the pattern, the shape that I've set. Now, a slight variation of the pathway hardscape is this one here, which is essentially a pathway hardscape, but it's really only displaying one edge of the pathway, and this can be very useful for doing edgings and borders around garden beds and so on. So that's essentially what the hardscape tool can do, and of course, because you can look in the object info palette and see the main area, the border area, the footprint area, and the perimeter and so on, all of these things can be produced in a report, so you can very easily produce a list of quantities that will call out the areas and add them up, and you can put cost rates against them and so on. So that's a quick overview of what the hardscape is and what it can do. The next thing I want to talk about are the hardscape settings, and going back to the layer we had before. When I have an existing hardscape, I can use this hardscape settings button here in the object info palette to access the settings for the hardscape. And if I haven't placed any hardscapes, or I want to change the default settings in the file for new hardscapes, I can also access the same dialog by selecting the hardscape tool and clicking on this button up here. Now, I'm actually going to use the hardscape settings button for this hardscape to demonstrate here. So let's click on this button and take a look at the settings in here. Now, firstly, here you can see the name of the hardscape, so you can name the various hardscapes, and this is useful if you want to call them out into a worksheet and list the various hardscape areas around your project, because then you can identify them and you know which one the areas and calculations are referring to. You can set the default tag to right, left, floating, or none. The tag style, we talked about the fact that you could have the name and the area. This is where you can set what appears, whether it's name areas, perimeters. You can also set a class for the hardscape, whether there's a tag line, whether the tag snaps to the edge of the hardscape or is floating like I had with this one, so I can position the arrow wherever I like it. We can choose the joint pattern. In here I have a hatch that's applied from the attributes palette, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. But you can either apply the interior fill here from within this dialog using the joint pattern options here for some standard ones like flagstone, grid, pavers running, and then you can also put hatches here, stipples and tiles. Or you can do that directly from the attributes palette, and I'll show you that when I close this dialog. We can also put this in a class. Now here's the configuration for whether the object is a boundary object or a pathway object, and if it were a pathway object, here is the width of the path and the offset from the center line that has been drawn to create the path. If we want a border, we can turn this on. We can specify the width of the border and what kind of fill we want, whether we want to have space joints, a hatch, a stipple or a tile around the border. We can choose a background color for the border and put it in a class. If it's a pathway, and I'll just move this over so you can see, this pathway has a left, right, start and end border, and these four options here allow you to choose whether or not there's a border at each end of the path, for example, and so on. For this edging here, this is set like that so it actually only has a border along one edge, but I'll talk about that in a moment. You then have the option of drawing this in 3D, and you've got slab, pad modifier or a texture bed modifier, and these last two are to work with the site model command or the digital terrain modeler. And if you are working in 3D, then you can set the main and border textures. For the textures you need to have Renderworks. Alright, so we'll cancel out of that, and now I'll open the settings for this one here. And you'll see that this is set to draw border, and it's got pathway borders as we were just talking about. It doesn't have a name, but if I gave it a different name then it would be listed separately. Let me just demonstrate. If I turned off the start and end pathway borders, then you'll see that at each end the borders are no longer there. Now let's take a look at the settings for this one, because it's a bit tricky. If you want to use it to create an edging, what you need to do is to choose to create a border and decide on the width of your border, and here the border is going to be 300 millimeters wide, and I've chosen spaced joints, and we either want left or right only, so we don't want start or end, and only one of these two. And here's the important bit: the width has to be 1 millimeter wider than this width up here. If you set these two to the same, you won't get anything appearing, so this has to be just 1 millimeter bigger. And then I have an offset set there so that the line that I've defined is actually on one edge rather than down the center of this border, which is probably a more common thing. So that gives you an idea of the settings for the hardscape object. So putting that information together, let's take a look at how we can create hardscapes. I'll begin by switching to a layer that I've just got a couple of ideas sketched on. These are just a series of lines and some polylines indicating some areas where I might want to do some designing. So just design guidelines essentially. Now I'm going to start by creating some polylines using the polygon tool in paint bucket mode. And here, if I click inside this bounded area here, it will create a polyline that has the same boundary as the area I clicked on. I want to convert this area here into a hardscape. Now it came in as this grey color because the default fill I have is set to grey, and I just did that so that you can actually see that process happen then. Okay, so the next step to this process is to set up the Hardscape tool to have the settings that I require for this hardscape. So we click on the tool, and then up here in the mode bar we click on the button that allows us to choose the settings we want. Now we'll probably just go with the default settings here, which has a border on it, and we don't currently have a joint pattern, and I'll set that from the attributes palette. And so we'll just go with the settings that are here at the moment. Again, if I want this to name this, I could give it a name. So we'll click OK. And now what I'm going to do, firstly I'll indicate that you can draw a hardscape using the Hardscape tool. So using the controls up here, I could actually just draw a hardscape like this and finish it off, and I'll get a hardscape with the settings that I've defined. But I actually want to create a hardscape from some geometry I already have on the drawing, in this case a polyline. So what I can do is either to go up to the Modify menu, go down to Objects from Polyline, but more easily right click on this and choose Objects from Polyline from the menu, from the contextual menu here. I then can choose the kind of object that I want to convert this shape into, and in this case it's a hardscape, but you'll see there's quite a few other choices there. And I don't want to retain this polygon, so I'll have Delete Source Polygon checked. I click OK, and this object has been converted into a hardscape, and you can see it's now saying it's a hardscape, not a polyline anymore. Now currently it has this grey fill that's been applied from the attributes palette. So if I change this to a hatch, for example, then I'll get a hatch pattern. If I change it to a different hatch, there's lots of different ones in here, then I'll get whatever pattern that is. Now the difference between applying something from the attributes palette and something from within the Hardscape tool is that when I do it from the attributes palette, I'm able to control the scale and rotation of the hatch more easily using the attribute mapping tool. And let me demonstrate that. This is the attribute mapping tool here, and you'll see the little bounding box that has appeared here represents one instance of this hatch. And if I move this around, the hatch will move, but more importantly I can scale the hatch. So if I click and drag on the corner here, you'll see the scale factor coming there. If I want it to be twice as big, I just type 2 and hit enter, and when I click again the hatch will be twice the size, and the name here will have turned blue because it's indicating that this hatch is actually edited. It's been edited by the attribute mapping tool. If I put the cursor over one of these center points, I also have the ability to rotate the hatch. Okay, so that's what you can do when you apply an attribute from out here. Now let me demonstrate the same thing if I were to give this, say, a gradient fill. And again, with the attribute mapping tool out here, I'm able to alter the angle of the gradient and the other aspects of the gradient, which I can't do when these things are applied from within the tool. And from within the tool I mean when you click on the Hardscape Settings button and choose to apply a hatch or something from here. So if I apply a hatch now, and let's pick a different one, say that one there, the hatch will get applied, and it's been applied over the top of this gradient that I already have in there. But I can't change the scale of this. All I can do is change the position of it, and pretty well that's it. And if I now take the gradient out, set this to none, then I'll just get the hatch that was applied in the settings dialog. And I can put a background color in that if I wanted to. Now you can also drag patterns and resources into a hardscape like this. Let me begin by just going to the hardscape settings here, and we'll turn off this. We'll set it to none. Click OK. So looking at our resource browser and clicking the little home button, I have a few resources in this file already, so I can just drag these over. So that would be a hatch. If I drag a gradient over, sometimes you have to drag it onto the line itself to be recognized. I have some image fills. If I drag that over, and you'll see that those things will get applied. And applying them by dragging them like this is the same as applying them from the attributes palette, except in this case I had these resources in my file. Here's another one here that I can drag onto here and get a different effect. And because I've applied this externally, I can use the attribute mapping tool to position this where I want it and to scale the whatever it is in here up to the desired size. Okay, so let's just go back to something simple like the stipple that we had here, and that can be the start. So we've got our design beginning now. Now let's say that along this line we want to create a path or a pathway object from a hardscape. So again, the first thing we do is to go to the hardscape tool and set it up for what we want it to look like. So we need to set it to a pathway, and we need to set up where we want the pathway borders to be, and the border width, and what we want it filled with, and so on. So let's just, again, we've just set it to this, leave the path at 1200, click OK, and now we're ready to convert this line into a hardscape pathway object. But once again, I can use the tool directly to draw a line that represents the path that I might want. So you'll see I just drew a line and that was converted into a pathway. Double clicking will allow me to edit the shape of it. So with the hardscape tool, you can always draw the boundary you want, or you can convert existing geometry into a hardscape, and that's what we're going to do with this polyline. So I've got the polyline there, right click, objects from polyline. I've already set up the hardscape tool to have the settings that I want. Click OK, and I'll now get this object as I want it. And just to match these up, let's set this to have a hatch. And again, if I didn't want the beginning or end up here, you know how we can change that. Now notice here the path width is also in the object info palette, as is the border width and the path offset. So if I want the path to be wider, I can just change the number here and it's going to get wider. If I want the border width to be narrower, I can just change that and the border width is going to be narrower as well. The next thing I want to do is to create some edging around this part here, and this object here is a polyline that extends all the way around here, and I only want the edging to start here, so I need to slice this object at that point there. The first thing I'm going to do in this process is to bring this object to the front to make sure that what I'm about to do, or this editing operation, affects this object. So I can just right click on it and choose Send to Front, and you'll notice that has a keyboard shortcut, Apple or Control F or Command F on a Mac. Control F on Windows, Command F on a Mac. So that will make sure that that object is at the front. I can then take the split tool here, and in split by point mode, which is the first mode, I just click on the point that I want to split. And it's going to ask me to confirm that choice because there are a couple of objects at that point, and you can see that the line that I want to split is highlighted, but to demonstrate what I mean, now the other line here is highlighted, so it's that one we want. So we click OK, and this has now been split into two objects, and you'll see that we've got that object there by itself, and that's what we need for the next operation. Now once again, let's click on the Hardscape tool, go up to the Settings dialog, and here we want to draw a border that is 300 wide. We only want the left, and remember this has to be 301 millimeters, or 1 millimeter larger than the size we've got up here. And we click OK, and then we can right click on here and choose Objects from Polyline, Hardscape. Now you'll notice that it created this edging here along the center line of that polyline that was previously there. Now that's okay. I could have made that adjustment in the settings dialog a moment ago, but the path offset is also here, and so I can just set that to 150, and that's just going to offset the path so that it's based along that edge. Alright, so that gets me this edging here, and so on. So I'm getting close to what I need. Now let's say that you wanted to fill this area in with some kind of color or planting or gradient. We can use the polygon tool in paint bucket mode again, or polygon from inner boundary, and click inside this area here, and you'll see that it's now filled that area or created a polygon from that area. And I could go to one of the libraries that comes with Vectorworks, say our vegetation, and there's lots of different things I could put in here, but you know, something like that for example, or this. And so on. I mean, assuming that you'd probably then overlay some plants and things on top of this, and if you want to reduce the intensity of that a bit, you can always change the opacity by clicking this button here, and let's say you just actually wanted that to be some kind of light background. Move the opacity down and it just becomes less prominent. Now a couple of other things about editing hardscapes, and it's quite common to want to extend a hardscape, and you can use the normal add and clip surface commands to do this. So let's say for example I wanted to extend this down here for whatever reason, and I could choose, let's say, the circle tool, and let's say I want to extend it out into this area around here. So my hardscape is this area here, and I want to add this area to it. So I've just defined an area. They just have to be touching or overlapping, which these two are, and then I can right click and right down the bottom here go Add Surface, and that's automatically going to then extend the hardscape around to include that shape that I had there. And that's the guideline that I had originally there, which I don't really need anymore. I can delete that. Likewise with that guideline I had as well. Now, as well as being able to add, we can also clip things out of here. And let's say that we had added this shape in here because there was going to be a tree or something, a shrub planted in here, and you needed to have a hole in the hardscape as well. Well, we can do that pretty easily if we again take the circle tool and we draw a shape that represents where we might want to cut the hole out. And I can position this down here, even nudge it if I want to get into the position I want. Doesn't have to be a circle, can be any shape. But again, once I have the whole position that I want, I select both it and the hardscape, and this time I right click and choose clip surface, and I can then delete this clipping object, and I'm left with my hardscape with a hole cut in it, just as I desired. Now, you're also able to split hardscapes. A few minutes ago we used the split tool to split this edge along here, so we could create that edging there, and I can use the same tool to split the hardscape if needed. So let's go to the split tool, and previously we used it in split by point mode, but here we can use it in split by line mode. And I'm going to select this object, and then I'll just do a random split, but I can just draw a line across here, and you'll see that that has split the hardscape into two. Now you might say, well, that's alright, but actually I don't want the double up of the edging here. So one other nice feature of hardscapes, and this applies to boundary hardscapes only, not pathway hardscapes, is that I can choose to hide edges of hardscapes. And to do this I need the 2D reshape tool, and I need to put it into this hide or show edges mode. And in this mode, if I click on an edge, then the edge will hide. So you'll see if I select this hardscape and I were to click on that edge, then I could hide that edge. And the same thing will even apply here. I can hide and show that edging there. So you can, this way you can very easily build up the hardscape, showing the edges that you want, hiding the edges that you don't want. So the final thing that I wanted to just mention is to prepare a report on the hardscapes. Now, I haven't been that disciplined in naming these hardscapes, but you can name them via the settings dialog, and if we look in here, we'll just name these, say, hardscape top, hardscape with hole, and we'll call this one hardscape path, and so on. So we'll call this one hardscape edging. Alright, so we've named our hardscapes. We'll now go up to the Tools menu, to Reports, to Create Schedule, and you'll see down here that we have some hardscape reports we've pre-configured. Here's one here called OzCAD Hardscape Quantities and Cost. So let's go ahead and we'll click and place that on the drawing. It's picked up the default fill color there, so I'll set that to none. Okay, and I'll double click this to edit it, and maybe we can just zoom it a little bit to make it a bit bigger. We can do that choosing zoom here. So here you can see that we've got the the names of the hardscapes that we gave them, whether they're a pathway or a boundary, and we've got the main area and the perimeter. And had we entered any of the other information, that other information being this stuff here, main unit price, main unit code, border unit price, and so on, then we could these other numbers would be filled out here, and we'd be able to get a costing on the hardscapes. The final thing I want to talk about with hardscapes is saving them, and you can actually save a hardscape as a resource from one project and reuse it in another project. Let's take a look at how you can do that. I'll switch now to a layer that has some hardscapes that we were working with previously. So we have 3 boundary hardscapes and we have a couple of pathway hardscapes, and all of these I have saved, and you'll see that the hardscapes, when you save them, are saved into a folder called Hardscapes under the Symbol Folders section in your resource browser. Now, to save a hardscape, you just select an existing hardscape, click the Save Hardscape, you give it a name, click OK, and that hardscape will be saved into the Hardscapes folder. So let's go ahead and open that folder, and you'll see here there are the 3 boundary hardscapes that I've saved, and here are the 2 pathway hardscapes that I've saved. Now, if I just grab the hardscape tool and without worrying too much about the settings, just draw a hardscape shape. Okay, so here it says hardscape. So in order to use one of these, all I need to do is to drag it over that shape, and this hardscape will take on those settings. So to demonstrate this with these 3 different boundary hardscapes, notice that I can do that. If I drag the 300 edging one over it, it will drop off that last segment there and just give me that edging to that shape. If I put the pathway, it will put that that shape in there. So it's a pretty convenient way to save hardscape patterns that you normally reuse. And of course, as with any other resource in Vectorworks, be it a hatch, a symbol, a texture, whatever, once you've created one of these in your file, assuming that you have a master library file, you can right click on this and choose to export it, and you can export it into your library file so that it's available more easily for you to access in future projects. And we talk about this exporting process in the other movie on the resource browser. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of an idea of how hardscapes work, and you'll be able to put that to good use.